Good evening, everyone. Welcome to IKG's Wisdom Wednesday. I am your host, Ajwa, and I am happy that you are here joining us for tonight's program. As always, I want to start off by welcoming our family who's checking in from all over the world. And we would like for you to let us know where you are checking in from. So if you haven't already, please feel free to drop in the chat your city, your state, your country, and give everybody a hey. As you all are doing that, I would like to remind you of some quick housekeeping notes. So, this is a webinar, which means that your video and audio are automatically muted. And we encourage you to engage tonight's conversation utilizing the chat. If you have questions for our speaker, there is a separate Q&A box where you can post your questions to ensure they are answered during the Q&A portion of tonight's program. So before we get started, let's take a look. I want to say thanks to everybody checking in from Maryland, Texas. We got Bowie in Baltimore, Maryland in the house. Ashburn, Virginia. Welcome, Ashburn, Virginia. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Thank you for joining us. Chicago, Illinois. It's quite busy in your city this week. Thank you for checking in from Chicago. We have Toronto, Canada, DC in the house, Rhode Island in the house. And as Brooklyn is in the house. Okay, so as you all are coming on in, again, do drop in your location. And of course, we have Washington, D.C. in the house. Welcome, family, for joining us. So, again, for those who may be new, IKG is a monthly lecture series where we host various speakers that speaks to topics related to African and Black history, culture, spirituality, finance, a variety of areas that affect our lives. And we hope that with these presentations, you are able to gain information that inspires you and help you to uplift not only yourself, but your family, community, and our people as a whole. There are a few programs that IKG will be participating in, and our director, Tony Browder, will be participating in, and we want to let you know about those events. On September 7th, Tony Browder will be speaking at the second historic Abibi Tumi Conference and Festival. This is a Black Power Vision to Reality conference happening September 6th through the 8th in Aquapem, Mampong, Ghana. There is an online option to view this conference, and that is at conference.abibitumi.com. Abibitumi is spelled Abibitumi. Again, that's conference.abibitumi.com, and I will post that in the chat. And again, that's the second historic Abibitumi Conference and Festival. Also, the week of September 20th through the 21st, IKG will be hosting the ASA Restoration Project 16th anniversary fundraiser, and that will be taking place here in Washington, D.C. There is also an option to view the programming on September 20th. On September 20th, there will be a brother to brother conference featuring Tony Browder and Dr. Charles Finch, who will be discussing brotherhood, peoplehood, culture, and their work. And that will take place again Friday, September 20th, 2024, here in Washington, D.C. And I will post more information for that event in our chat. And then on September 21st in Washington, D.C., there will be an evening with Anthony Browder at the Tutankhamun tomb and at the Tutankhamun tomb here in Washington, D.C. It will be a fundraiser, a reception, and a private tour of the exhibit. And I will post again that information in the chat for you to purchase tickets. So now I would like to invite our speaker of the evening to join us. And I would like to introduce you to Dr. N. Kameron Akheru. Tonight, he will be speaking on Decolonized by Design, Reimagining the World by Any Means Necessary. He writes, "We must all decolonize our minds in Western culture," wrote Bell Hooks, 1952 to 2021, "to be able to think differently about nature, about the destruction humans cause." Decolonized by Design is a series of visual essays by artist and scholar N. Kameron Akheru that examines the meaning and significance of what Franz Omar Fanon described as the historical process of decolonization from Pan-African perspectives throughout the African diaspora. As an organic and independent intellectual intervention in the history of Western discourses and epistemologies, the radical tradition of Black Africana studies represents a historical bridgehead in the war of ideas. If, as Angela Davis asserts, the ultimate significance of knowledge is its capacity to transform our social worlds, then the ultimate purpose of decolonization is not merely freedom from oppression, but a kind of sovereignty that reimagines the world by any means necessary. Ultimately, Decolonized by Design aims to serve as an African-centered catalyst for the holistic cultivation of historical knowledge, critical literary skills, and the revalorization of anti-Black consciousness among people who see themselves as global citizens in the 21st century. For as Malcolm X wrote in 1963, the Black Revolution is worldwide in scope and in nature. Now about our speaker. Dr. N. Kameron Akheru is a multi-hyphenate writer, an activist, independent intellectual, and emancipatory edupreneur who employs critical race structural competency and the praxis of decolonization to advance reparatory justice initiatives aimed at social transformation. Currently, Dr. Akheru teaches Black Africana Studies at California State University, Long Beach, and College Unbound. He is the founder and CEO of Akheru Enterprises and the president of the Center for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, a not-for-profit organization dedicated to advancing human freedom and flourishing sans bias. As a long student of African history, culture, and theosophy, Dr. Akheru has been recognized for numerous achievements in education and is a two-time recipient of the Pedro Noguero Volunteer of the Year Award. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa with a Bachelor of Arts in African American Studies and a minor in education from the University of California, and holds a PhD in African and African American Studies with an emphasis in the history of art and architecture from Harvard University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Akheru.
And wonderful. Thank you so much.
To you.
Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Peace and blessings to everyone. Thank you, Sister Ajwa, for that wonderful introduction. I know that was a mouthful. I'm going to keep my bio briefer in the future. But I appreciate your taking the time to introduce me. I want to start by thanking my teacher in Jegna, Tony Browder, who I've had the pleasure of knowing since, I guess, about 2011 or so. And also his daughter Atlantis have just really poured into my life and my journey. And so it's really an honor for me to be able to participate in this time-honored tradition, Wisdom Wednesdays. Just an incredible space that IKG has created for us to dialogue and to expand our awareness, and that's why I'm here. And I look forward to learning from you and sharing a little bit of my reflections and thoughts with you and some of the things I've been working on as it pertains to Pan-African centered education, which is what I want to discuss this evening. So with that, I will share my screen, and we'll have some time to discuss some of the thoughts and ideas that I've been working on in the course of writing a book on this subject. And I'm gonna pause here, make sure I do this right. Hopefully, okay. So hopefully you all can see my screen.
Yes, we
Uh,
can.
okay, thank you. So as Ajwa mentioned, I created a research institute uh, called the African Diaspora Institute. And the institute is basically focused on three fundamental tenets: ancestry, remembering our past, uh, sovereignty, recognizing our present and our power, and then legacy, which is really about realizing our potential, our utmost potential in the future, not only for ourselves but for future generations. So those are the pillars of the African Diaspora Institute, and the work we do, a lot of it is primarily in the arena of education. That's this here. So what I like to do first, bear with me one moment. Okay. All right. So what I like to do at the outset, uh, just to kind of warm us up and get us thinking and envisioning things that I want to discuss, is just ask everyone to take a few moments and look at this image. This piece is a digital collage piece that I created called "Remember," the reawakening of Black gods. And I just want to give you a chance to look at it for a few moments. And if you feel led to share anything that comes to mind in the chat, please do so. I just want to give folks a chance to kind of see something that may stimulate some thoughts, some ideas, some feelings, maybe some experiences. And I'll say that we're coming up on, I believe, 2026 will mark the 30th anniversary of the publication of Tony Browder's Survival Strategies, which is one of my anchor texts, a text that I like to refer back to and use when I teach my students. And so this piece is kind of an ode to that book, but also to uh, uh, a number of other artists and ancestors who I want to bring to the into the space this evening for our conversation. Um, and I'm not savvy enough to do it right now, but if I had it, I would invite you all to listen to a piece from the Ubiquity Roy Ayers classic Third Eye while you look at this. But you can, those of you who are familiar with that, you can kind of think about that. Okay. Let me reconnect the screen share here. Sorry about that. Trying to step back a little bit so I can see this. All right. So any reflections or thoughts about this image? And I'll go back to the full screen here. Feel free to, in fact, if you'd like to comment, just here for a moment before we move forward. You want to share anything that comes to mind as you look at this collage. Okay, I like this question. We're going to get into this question from Jeanette Edwards, language. And that's a good point. That prompts something I should say from the outset as well. So Well, before I get to the next slide, let me just say this. Language, and those of you who may have a comment on the image or can put it in the chat. Uh, there are two terms or concepts that I'm not going to use tonight. One is white supremacy, because it's a oxymoron, right? Um, and I'm not using it intentionally because, and I may use the word, white racial hierarchy or, structural racism and other terms, systemic racism. But I think that to the point that was made in that comment, language is important. And if you, and we may get to this, when you read uh, uh, or you look at, Baldwin's work or in survival strategies in terms of, Tony's discussion about the media, we understand the power of images and the power of signs. Words are signs, right? And so one of the things that we have to begin to do through this idea of decolonizing the mind or decolonization, or the work of renewing one's mind, if you will. For those of you who are familiar with the Judeo-Christian tradition, when I believe in Romans discusses, renewing the mind, right? Um, be not conformed, but to the ways of this world, but transformed, right, through the renewing of your mind. And so that renewing of the mind is a ongoing process. That decolonization, that reprogramming of the mind is an ongoing process. But when you're working within the English language, as Baldwin has said, and as many others have commented upon, you're constantly at war with the very language in which you dream, the very language in which you imagine your reality. And so one of the things, as an educator, my medium is the mind, right? And so my primary concern is with the expansion of consciousness, right? And so I'm constantly encouraging my students and trying to facilitate and foster to educate, right? Which is to cultivate or to draw out, right? So it's not so much about me pouring in or teaching them things as much as it is helping them, facilitating the process of reawakening, right, a certain level of consciousness, expanding, planting seeds so that they can grow in their own development and, in some sense, remember who they are, particularly when we're discussing groups of people like African Americans or Africans in the Americas who have suffered from cultural amnesia, who have been disconnected from our past, right? And so decolonizing the mind, part of that is looking at language and uh, at least having a critical awareness of the fact that so much of the language that we use is a byproduct of colonialism, slavery, racism, right? And so we have to begin to even question and challenge the words we use, the way in which we speak to each other, way in which we, and most importantly, perhaps the way in which we even see ourselves, right? The way in which we speak to ourselves and think of ourselves, right? And so that is part of what this work of decolonizing the mind is about. Um, so thank you for that comment. So this idea of decolonized by design, reimagining the world by any means necessary, really is somewhat inspired, even though I came to it in a different and a roundabout way by something that Anthony Browder says in Survival Strategies, and I'm just going to share this quote with you here. Uh, Within the soul of African Americans was an unwavering spirit that refused to be dominated. This spirit nurtured a belief in a receptive host, that there was much more to life than enslavement, poverty, and ignorance. As this spirit grew, the chains of mental bondage slackened, and the consciousness of the enslaved Africans began to expand. Those who nurtured this spirit achieved a state of mental freedom. Like Harriet Tubman, these brave ancestors ventured back into the danger zone in an attempt to liberate those who remain mentally and physically enslaved to a way of life not of their own design, right? Freeing the body also meant freeing the mind. And over time, the formerly enslaved Africans had to be brought into the light of consciousness, right? This is the real baptism, right? not even the fire that James Baldwin talks about in The Fire Next Time, but in terms of social revolution per se, but the fire of enlightenment, right? Of being reborn from above, right? In terms of your perception and your consciousness and your ability to empathize and connect with others and with your environment, and begin to see yourself as an aspect of the divine. This is the fire, the light, the enlightenment that I'm talking about. And so, what does it mean then to begin to reimagine ourselves and the world, you know, and to do that with a sense of urgency, right? As Malcolm X uh, uh, would say, in terms by any means necessary, right? Um, and so, just to finish up, they were taught to value the value of knowing their true names, and reminded, excuse me, that only dogs and slaves were named by their masters, right? And so, this whole concept, as an educator, uh, for me, has to do with Pan-African centered education and socialization, and I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. But what does it mean to really, especially in this current environment, where we are um, constantly rehearsing this sort of defensive posture? Um, for example, we can go back and we can look at sort of the articulations, the voice, the aspirations, the protests of our ancestors, and we can see a continuum of that, right? Whether it's Sojourner Truth, asking the question, "Ain't I a woman?" Right? Or sanitation workers marching with Dr. King in the '60s, saying, "I am a man," right? Or more recently, Black Lives Matter protests and movements for racial justice asserting this this protest chant, Black Lives Matter. Why does one need to say that, right? Like Malcolm said, why does one need to advocate for civil rights? Either you have them or you don't, right? And so, thinking about that continuity of struggle, right, and its importance, but then also thinking, how do we begin to move beyond protest? How do we begin to move beyond sort of this constant uh, uh, defensive position, right? Which is not to say that those struggles are not important or meaningful, or that they don't, or that they should not continue. But we also have to have other strategies, right? As Tony Browder would say, survival strategies, right? But not just survival strategies, but also strategies that will allow us to thrive, right? And allow our children not simply to survive, but to thrive, right? And so, thinking about what kind of deposit we want to make in the next generation, my approach to that, and what I want to discuss here is, this sort of idea of a Pan-African centered approach, right, to education and socialization that really is about reconnecting with our African centered roots, right, and projecting ourselves forward in a way and with a mentality and with a consciousness that is no longer shackled by, not just the social, economic, and political oppression, but the psychological warfare, right? The mental oppression that's the last stronghold of enslavement, of bondage, is the mind, right? And so, while we may have achieved, freedom, we just celebrated Juneteenth not too long ago, right? In certain domains, uh, we really need to be able to ask ourselves what constitutes freedom in the 21st century, right? And not just thinking about freedom from physical enslavement, but freedom in the future, freedom in the present, right? And what that looks like. Um, and so, just redefining what struggle looks like, what freedom looks like, and ultimately what the goal is, in terms of attaining a level of sovereignty, not just politically, but spiritually and mentally. So that is sort of summation of what this idea of decolonization by design, right, with intention, right, is about, with the sort of the inspiration, the ideation, the intention, the articulation and the action, right, and then the movement, the manifestation, right, of a decolonized future. And so going back to something that Tony Browder has said in his work, uh, which I find just so important to remember. This this realization, this recognition that there was a time in the distant past when those responsible for overseeing the development of our youth knew that they were spiritual beings who had taken a human form, right, and had a special role to play in life. They were taught that their thoughts, words, and deeds reflected their understanding of their mission in life. Thus, their perceptions, and we're going to talk about the neuroscience of perception a little bit, of themselves, determined their ability to live up to their potential as human beings or spiritual beings having a human incarnation, if you will. And so, unfortunately, this blueprint for human development, for human flourishing, has been unavailable for generations of Africans living in America. Their perceptions of themselves, who they are, and who they are to become have been distorted by the society in which they live. As a result, they have been conditioned to believe that they must go outside of themselves in order to find reality. So we're going to talk a little bit about the nature of reality and the structure of reality as well. As a result, they have been conditioned to believe that they must go outside of themselves in order to find reality. The only way out of this dilemma, writes Crowder, is for people to learn to reach within and nurture those timeless perceptions of self, which will help them construct a new reality. This is very, very important. Like I said, I think in 2 years we're going to be hitting the 30th anniversary of this text, which is a milestone. That's something that's really important for us to constantly reach back and celebrate our elders and celebrate the wisdom that's been shared and passed on and to pass it on. So in the same spirit of what Brother Tony is saying, Elder Tony is saying, um, I'm reminded of what Frantz Fanon said, right? And we know Fanon was concerned with the mind, right? As a psychologist working in North Africa, right? And he said each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. And so when I think about my mission as an educator, and I think about being in a position to help our youth discover or realize their own mission, and then not only to realize it but to fulfill it, you know, this is where we begin to really understand the vital importance of the work that we're doing, in terms of Pan-African centered education and socialization, or PACES. Okay, so let's set the pace for the future. I like to start or make sure that I give space and time to acknowledge and welcome into the space the ancestors, those who have come before us. And so I like to share this quote from Ralph Ellison, author of Invisible Man, among many other award-winning novels and essays. But Ellison says, some people are your relatives, but others are your ancestors. And you choose the ones you want to have as ancestors because you create yourself out of those values. And so the question simply is, who are you creating yourself out of? Right? Because none of us exist in a vacuum. Nature abhors the vacuum, right? And so who are the people, who are the ancestors who have brought us to where we are today? You can see in my background, Dr. King, who also I share Mende ancestry with Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., also with Marcus Garvey. And so these are men of valor who I'm fortunate enough to share African ancestry with, but who also I have embraced as an ancestor for myself, right? In terms of helping me to understand my mission. And in our conversations, Tony and I have talked about, the real AI. And so I wanted to include this from him that you all can see here. This comment, which is a brilliant, I think, way of putting it, talking about ancestral intelligence. I thought the original AI, right? And so, really thinking about, the genetic memory and tapping into those Akashic records, if you will, right? The blueprint, the literal memories, and we know from epigenetics research now that we can inherit uh, things. Unfortunately, sometimes it's trauma, right? From past generations, and so the science is beginning to catch up to what traditional African spirituality and traditional African cultures have always known and understood in terms of the meaning and the significance of ancestry, and the importance of acknowledging that, venerating our ancestors, acknowledging our ancestors, and drawing upon their strength. And so, when you think about 10,000 times 10,000 ancestors within us, and the importance of acknowledging that, and doing the work we need to do to fulfill our mission. And so just always encourage, as we all talk about AI and, generative AI and the way that technology is shaping the future, and it does, at a rate faster than anything else. Technological innovation. We are technology, though, in ourselves. We have spiritual technology. We have biological technology that is already there if we understand and value it and are able to recognize and tap into it, right, and be available to it. So with that, I just wanted to give you another chance to look at some additional images, and I wanted to lift up, at least visually, some of the ancestors. Nikki Giovanni writes, storytelling is how history is passed. It's what our ancestors did. It's what everybody's done. It has to come back into a story. And so in telling our stories, in telling our children our stories, and in transmitting our culture, these are ways in which we reaffirm who we are, who we've been, who we are, and who we aim to be in the future, right? And so just understanding the importance of knowing thyself as the divine, and really tapping into and connecting with those who came before us. Like this piece from Rita Dove, isn't reality magic? One definition of eternity is that we are not alone on this planet, that there are those who've gone before and those who will come, and that there is a community of spirits, right? And so what does all this mean for us as we stand on the precipice, on the eve of, presidential election, where we are looking at the possibility of, the first Black woman to be president of the United States, right? How does that happen? Where are we? How do we move forward? While we see, on one hand, Kamala Harris, her ascendancy, right, as emblematic of something profound, and at the same time, in the same moment, we see, Black women being shot in the face, Black men being shot down, Black people being shot down in the streets by so-called police officers, right? And we saw the same thing during the Obama's ascendancy, right? And so, we also realized that this year marks the 70th anniversary of the Roe v. Wade, excuse me, not Roe v. Wade, Brown v. Board of Education, 1954 Supreme Court decision, right? And so here we are, these contradictions. We've seen the banning of books, the banning of Black history, the banning of history, period. The corruption within the Supreme Court, in my view, and attempts to turn back the clock, as they say, on gains that our ancestors made secure during the long civil rights movement, right? Everything from voting rights to education, you name it. It's all on the table. And so how do we reconcile? How do we reconcile? And how do we make sure that we don't have to relitigate the same struggles that our ancestors have already fought? I'm not marching for voting rights, right? We did that already, you know. And yet we find ourselves in this cycle, right? And Derek Bell, the father of critical race theory, would call it the permanence of racism, right? We find ourselves in this cycle, right? And so at some point we have to begin to break the cycle and gotta ask ourselves, what do we need to do differently, right? We value and appreciate what our ancestors did. What do we need to do differently? Do we need to be thinking differently, right? About the problem itself, right? What is the problem? How do we define it, right? Baldwin said the function of language is to control the world by describing it, right? Right? That's power, right? To be able to define reality, right? First, you got to be able to imagine it, right? And then you got to be able to codify it and define it, right? Um, Huey P. Newton said, power is the ability to define phenomena and make it act according to your will, right? Paraphrasing, right? And so thinking about these ancestors and how we carry them forward into the future through the work that we do, right? And tapping into the strength and the power that these sisters and brothers of all of the full diversity and spectrum of the African diaspora, right? How we tap into that in the spirit of Ubuntu and Uhuru, right? Unity and freedom, right? In the spirit of Sankofa, right? So we just want to begin to get us thinking about these concepts, these principles, these ideas. And so understanding a little bit of context, as I mentioned before, it's so important that we connect with our past and that we study our past. And that's why my background, as was mentioned earlier, is in Black Africana studies, which I really view, particularly the Black radical tradition of Africana studies, right? Pan-African studies, right? And really, I look at it as an interdisciplinary field, but also as the theology and as a philosophy or a theosophy, if you will, right? Because for me, this is not just an academic topic, right, or an academic subject. This is something much much deeper than that. Something profound, something spiritual, and it's really important that we talk about it and talk about ourselves as subjects, as the subjects, right? Toni Morrison of history of our own story, right? Of our our personal legend, or right, our heroes or Heru's journey, right? Understanding that, because there are times in which I feel that uh we kind of succumb to becoming the object of someone else's discourse, right? Rather than being the subject of our own story, right? And so, as Tony says, the liberation of the African mind, body, and spirit can only be achieved through the use of African-centered value systems that make the study of the successes and the failures of the past the highest priority. He's saying what Malcolm X said, right? In terms of history being best qualified to reward our research, right? So this is why it's so important that we prioritize the study of our ancestors, of our past, of our successes and our failures, so that we can understand how to secure our future, and not to find ourselves in this constant cycle, right? That I alluded to earlier. Other people know who we are, we don't know who we are, right? And so our problem, beyond all of the external things, our fundamental problem really has to do with the mind, right? And that's why we talk about decolonization, right? What does that mean? I'm gonna move a little bit more quickly because I want to have time for conversation. But again, I'm just kind of, you know, referencing some of the people who have shaped my own thinking, um, and who are important in terms of making sure that we have this kind of intellectual lineage that we're constantly immersing ourselves in and growing and expanding, right? When we think about the work of Asa Hilliard and, you know, John Henry Clark and just so many, Tony Browder, so many people who have, I mean, advanced cinema, just so many people, some of whom have transitioned, many of whom have transitioned. Um, and yet we find ourselves in this place, and where we're continuing to have to struggle and to fight for just the basic understanding of our history, of our culture, and so I'm arguing in part here that we need to institute paradigm shift. And what I'm saying is not new. So don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting this is new information, but I think we do need a new generation, new energy, and we need to adopt some new strategies in terms of how we move forward and build on the work of Cheikh Anta Diop, right? Who really, among others, the boys and others really established, the importance of our role in the ancient past and now about the civilization, and others have come and connected that and moved that forward. And so just really kind of revalorizing this history and understanding its importance. Now, I mentioned before, consciousness, and I want to connect some dots and kind of zoom out a little bit here and think about what all of this history and the contributions of our ancestors and our intellectuals and our scholars um, really means in a broader context. And so I just want to offer a few thoughts about physics, and really thinking about the spectrum of the physical sciences, right? So we're thinking about astrophysics, thinking about what we would call, Newtonian physics classically, right? In the European tradition, if you will. And but also, thinking about quantum physics, right? Um, and and thinking about all that within the context of, how we understand the nature and structure of reality itself, right? And why consciousness is so key. Um, why we have to begin to reimagine the world, reimagine ourselves, and think about how we elevate the consciousness not only of our community and our children, but of humanity as a whole, right? Because um, I would contend that uh, this sort of what's thought of as sort of a hierarchy of classes of civilization, right? Typically is thought of as how, or is based on how well a species utilizes the energy in its environment, on a planetary scale, right? Um, but and there's value in that certainly, but I think that really what it means to have a civilization is to have civility, to have peace, right? And to have a level of compassion. Um, and in my view, we really don't have that as a species. We haven't achieved that, right? And so, thinking about what it means to elevate and to evolve. Excuse me. I always tell my students we must evolve to solve problems, right? Um, and so, if we think about some of the ancient texts, some of the ancient philosophies and teachings that came out of Kemet, that came out of the African deep thought, right? The past came out of Nile Valley civilization, that cultural complex, right? We think about, uh, the philosophical underpinnings that inform the Greeks and the Romans and Western culture, right? We think about these tenets that you see here, these hermetic principles. And I would encourage anyone who hasn't read, say, Ancient Future by Wayne B. Chandler, to read that book, or there are other sources you can certainly look and find online dealing with these concepts that are attributed to Jehuti or Thoth, right? Or Hermes, right? But without getting too deeply into that, I just want to touch on these ancient principles and ideas, this ancient wisdom, and then also connect it out to sort of modern thought and science, right? And whether it's astrophysics or metaphysics, right? Thinking about, how science is, as I say, catching up to things that our ancestors were doing, thinking, writing about, teaching, right, and sharing with those who were initiated into this knowledge, right? And we can find evidence of that in the African mythology of the Dogon, for example, or certainly in ancient civilizations, particularly in Kemet, but also among the quote unquote Aboriginal people of Australia, right? And I say that because the word Aboriginal doesn't sit well with me per se, but the indigenous peoples, right, and their dreamland and their mythology, right, and going and then looking all over the world at, the connections between these ancient structures, megaliths, and these ancient philosophies and understandings, and we see those things reflected in modern day science, modern day scholarship, right? So, you have a Buddhist philosopher like Alan Watts who says, stars shine out of space. The blackness is already there, right? What light shines out of the infinite darkness, right? That's already there, right? And so if we understand the principle of correspondence, what does that mean for the micro level, right? We think about the macro, we also think about the micro and the correspondence between the two. So understanding that we need to look within at the same time that we try to understand the external environment, and the cosmos, right, and the vastness of it, right? It's expanding, right? Dark matter, dark energy is expanding, right? And so how do we expand the gray matter, right? How do we expand the mind? How do we expand our consciousness, right? And so again, astronomers are beginning to realize that the stars are a function of space, right? There's a relationship here, and we know that's true because when we look at quantum physics, right, and ideas like superposition, right, and entanglement, right, scientists have been able to show that there's a relationship between the observer and the observed, right? And so there's this constant dialectic happening, whereby we have to realize that we are part of nature and that we are uh, uh, inextricably linked, and that our intention and attention is part of that relationship, right? Dynamic between at the very small level, you know. Uh, so for every star you can see, there exists about 10 times more mass in a non-luminous matter, right? Such as gas clouds billowing around in interstellar space. Even more so, for all ordinary matter, there exists 5 times as much mass in dark matter, expected to be made of exotic unknown particles floating across the universe. And finally, there exists 3 times more dark energy, the puzzling fuel that drives the fabric of space-time to expand faster and faster, right? And this is from a book that was published last year. The One, How an Ancient Idea Holds the Future of Physics. Okay. Heinrich Paz, right? Interesting. Let's jump over to Harvard University and Smithsonian. All the atoms and light in the universe together make up less than 5% of the total contents of the cosmos. The rest is composed of dark matter and dark energy, which are invisible but dominate the structure and evolution of the universe. Dark matter makes up most of the mass of galaxies and galaxy clusters and is responsible for the way galaxies are organized on grand scales. Dark energy, meanwhile, is the name we give the mysterious influence driving the accelerated expansion of the universe. What these substances are and how they work are some of the major challenges facing modern astronomers. So there's at least 3 types of knowledge, arguably more, but we have known knowns, right? We have known unknowns, and we have unknown unknowns, right? Things we don't even know. We don't even know what question to ask, right? And so as we think about the cosmos expanding and the scale of that, right? And we think about space-time and this dark matter, dark energy, this expansion, what does that look like? And we go back to the second principle of correspondence. We have to ask ourselves, what does that look like? for us? What does that look like on the micro level, right? How is our consciousness, how is our universe expanding? You have a universe inside of you, right? What's going on in that space, right? Um, and then lastly, an interesting book by Deepak Chopra called MetaHuman, 2019. Everything you think you see has been processed inside your brain in a specific region known as the visual cortex, which is totally dark, right? So this yin and yang, this play between dark and light, right? This relationship, this link, two sides of the same coin, you could say, right? How does all of that manifest the macro scale, but also at the micro, right? And how do we think about when we teach our children from a Pan-African centered point of view, how do we give them this science, this knowledge, right? Um, and make sure that they understand that this is not knowledge that is foreign, but this is knowledge that originates with them, right? And that they carry within them, right? And I included just there at the bottom our sister Octavia Estella Butler, right? Um, who those of you who are science fiction buffs like myself will know. She wrote very prophetically in the Parable of the Sower series, parables, Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents, Xenogenesis or Luthe's Brood is a good series as well. But those parable stories really talk about things that we are seeing now, in terms of the rise of fascism and authoritarianism and, you know, and the need for greater empathy, right, in the world. And the things that are unfolding, it's interesting to really think about, how did she know, right? What did she know, right? Where was she? What was she trying to share with us? Just food for thought. So again, kind of condensing all of that in the person of a George Washington Carver, right? Who I think brilliantly said, and maybe one of the most profound kind of conceptions of these ideas that I'm discussing, is just encapsulated in this very elegant words from Carver. He says, "What is the infinite? What is the infinite?" He asked. Is it that silent small force? It isn't the I'm sorry, it is the silent small force. It is not that outer physical contact. No, it isn't that. The infinite is not confirmed in the visible world, yet when you look out upon God's beautiful world, there it is. When you look into the heart of a rose, there you experience it, but you can't explain it. There are certain things, often very little things, that cause you to look within, and then you see the soul of things. Sounds like quantum physics, quantum mechanics, right? From George Washington Carver, right? There are certain things, often very little things, that cause you to look within, and then you see the soul of things, right? So he's talking about spirit. He's talking about the invisible reality. He's talking about uh, archetypes and things that exist in the invisible or in the spirit before they exist in the physical, in this three-dimensional reality that we inhabit, when we take on a human body, right? And so just thinking about what it means to reawaken the infinite, because the mind is infinite, right? This is your spaceship, right? The mind's infinite, but are we utilizing it to the full extent, right? And so, just thinking about again these ideas and how they inform the way we even conceive of education, and I want to segue from Carver a little bit to Einstein, because this is a picture at the bottom of Albert Einstein at Lincoln University. And, people don't talk about Einstein's work with Paul Robeson. They usually talk about, physics, right? E equals MC squared. They talk about his scientific work, but his social justice legacy was also significant, right? He was at he was at Lincoln, right, teaching, and he talked about racism and he talked about he was what we would call an anti-racist, if you will, right? And so just understanding, that science, see, a true genius is someone who's not just scientifically book smart, but also compassionate and humane, has evolved themselves morally, spiritually, characteristically. You know, European culture, European cultural history, and European knowledge, epistemology, right? Systems of knowledge and thought is full of people that are considered the father of this. There are no women really that are credited with anything much, but they're credited with, European scholars are credited with discovering and inventing and such, so on and so forth. But a great many of them were moral failures, right? For example, Watson and Crick, discovered the structure of the double helix, but they were doing that work to advance pseudo-scientific, racism, right? They were doing that work to try and prove white, quote unquote, white superiority, right? Or white racial, and to reassert white racial dominance, right? And so if you think about knowledge absent ethics, or without morals and ethics, right? Without compassion, what you get is the sort of the corruption of intellect, so that the gifts of intellect that and talents that we may have end up just producing greater, more technologically advanced modes and forms of destruction, right? And so we have to make sure that as we are being socialized in sort of Western culture, right, as we're Africans, right? Only survival strategies, right, for Africans in the Americas, right? As we are trying to navigate the social, economic, political, and cultural terrain of sort of Western cultural modernity, right? We have to make sure that our gifts are not being corrupted, or not being sort of misused or misapplied, or that we are not allowing ourselves to be exploited, right? In the service of those who seem to only focus on, building bigger, better bombs, right? And so really, really kind of realizing that there's a really important ethic of Ubuntu, right? I am because you are. I am because we are. We are one, right? That ethic, and this goes back to the Pan-African piece of it, that ethic, all right, the principles of Kwanzaa, right? These are things that must inform our education and our socialization, right? And so we continue to kind of think about that. Now, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Dr. Sylvester James Gates Jr., um, who is a brilliant theoretical physicist specializing in string theory, M theory, quantum mechanics, quantum physics. Okay. But in 2020, right? 2020 vision, right? He presented this research and at the International Institute of Nanotechnology. Okay. He was at Northwestern University, but he's right here now. He's right here at the University of Maryland. He was at Maryland. He moved. He came back, as far as I know. And so he's here. He served on President Barack Obama's research team during, I think it was his first administration. Okay. And he has done some incredible, he's basically extended Einstein's work on unified field theory. Right. Einstein was trying to demonstrate and prove, like scientifically, like mathematically, right? Empirically, the oneness of the universe. He was trying to prove those tenets and principles that I just, from the ancient, from Nile Valley civilization, from the Emerald tablets, from Tahuti, so he was trying to prove correspondence. He was trying to prove vibration. He was trying to prove scientifically, right? Empirically, those same philosophical ideas that used to be sort of, or at least within our tradition, within the African tradition of what we might call the African spiritual sciences, or the mystery system, right? That really were perfected in ancient Egypt, in Kemet, right? Now you have, people trying to understand that in through the lens of science, of Western science. And so, interestingly, let me go to something that our brother said in survival strategies, right? It says, no sane people willingly turns their back on their past. It is only by facing your past that you can accurately perceive reality and determine your destiny. Reality is a pathway to the future. African Americans cannot expect to have a sustainable future, right? If we believe we are something that never existed. Okay. And he goes on to talk about, understanding character, consciousness, compassion, creativity, right? Understanding being African centered and embracing that culture as opposed to having an identity that is predicated upon color, right? And we'll talk more about that in a second, because I think we can, in a way, we need to sort of reframe the meaning of blackness, right? And tie it back to its divinity in ancient Nile Valley civilizations. But but the point is well taken, and Ellison has said as much. It's not about so much race in the sociological sense as it is about, which is a construct anyway, but it is about consciousness, culture, right? Um, we are African people, as James Foreman said, right? In his work on reparations in the 60s, right? And so part of the Pan-African Centered Education and Socialization initiative is to reassert not just a cultural nationalism, because we can all do Kwanzaa, we can all do that, but to really create a society, a community, an ethic, an ethos, a theosophy, right? A way of being in the world, a worldview, a perspective that is driven by and dedicated to the expansion of, right, an African-centered or Pan-African-centered point of view, right? And so, and that's going to take us into the future. So it's interesting, right, that Sylvester James Gates Jr., in doing this, I mean, truly genius level research. What does he call it? He talks about it. He uses as a metaphor for his work, which is which involves geometry. Uses geometry to represent, and you can see a little bit of an example of it here in the slide. He used math and geometry specifically to give representation to what he understood to be, what he discovered to be the structure of reality, and he visualized it, right? And he called these visualizations symbols of power. He called them Indinkras, right? In fact, this article is called Symbols of Power, Indinkras, and the Nature of Reality. Okay. Now, why would Dr. Sylvester James Gates Jr. reach back to West Africa, to the Akan, right? Why would he specifically say, you know what, these are Indinkras? I want you to think about that, right? Because he could have, he could have called them anything, right? But he was intentional about connecting his research, right, and naming his research in a way that would resonate with this long tradition, this long ethical, aesthetic, philosophical tradition of West Africa, right? That's not an accident, right? And so really understanding that we have to be intentional and look for the connections between sort of past, present, and future. Okay. And I would highly recommend you go online, you can type in the title of this talk, you can watch the whole thing online. It's a brilliant discussion that really delves deep into the nature and structure of physical reality, and using M theory, string theory, using highly advanced quantum physics that are beyond me. But I understand enough to know that what Sylvester James Gates Jr. is talking about is vital to what I'm talking about in terms of expanding our consciousness and our perception of reality, right? And he interestingly he titles this talk "How Thinking Like a Geneticist, the Micro," right? The genetic level. That's as deep within as we can go. How thinking like a geneticist, help me solve a 25-year-old Einstein-type problem in string theory. That's the title of his talk. Okay. So again, we're thinking about levels of knowledge. We're thinking about the very, very small and the macro, the very, very large and big, right? And we're thinking about how all of these things connect back to African-centered spirituality, education, socialization, mythology, culture. I'm not going to go into, the Dogon and as much as I could, but I'll say this: if you look at in the far, I guess your right hand corner, and this is just me off the cuff, kind of an hypothesis, if you will, but that structure which is born from his research, reminds me very much of the tree of life, right? If you look at images of the tree of life, you see it sometimes in the esoteric traditions, right? You see it in Kabbalah, you see it in various esoteric traditions, but all of whom though have their roots in Nile Valley civilization. That very much the structure of it very much reminds me of that same tree of life diagram. And so it's very interesting to me. The resonance there is very interesting to me, that you would see more and more as Western science evolves and begins to understand, the Human Genome Project, begins to map the human genome, begins to be able to use these high power telescopes to see further, to see distant light, right? And we begin to understand how large the cosmos is. The more we learn, the more the more it reaffirms what we know is reaffirmed, or reaffirms what our ancient African ancestors were saying, right, millennia ago, right? So it's very interesting to think about these things in a broader context, and I'm very interested in the synthesis of these seemingly disparate forms of information. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time here, but I just wanted to kind of bring in uh, this quote, and I kind of set it up a little bit. But Toni Morrison, in a really classic essay that she wrote called "Home," 1997, which is the kind of preface to, or is an introduction to, a book called "The House That Race Built." An anthology. She talks about how the modern world essentially has been defined by these mass movements of racialized populations, right? Beginning with the largest forced transfer of people in the history of the world, the transatlantic or European slave trade, right? The consequences of which transfer have determined all of the wars following it, and as well as the current ones being waged on every continent, right? And so if you think about that, you think about Du Bois in 1915, I believe he wrote The African Roots of the War. You think about Aimé Césaire, okay, the father of negritude, right, talking about how and in Discourse of Colonialism, talking about essentially the chickens of colonialism coming home to roost in Europe, and leading to the Holocaust and leading to various atrocities. You think about what's happening now in the world, right? The sort of avant-garde of this sort of cultural imperialism and colonialism that we're seeing, the displacement and they had a refugee Olympic team in the Olympics this year. And I'm gonna exercise some restraint and not talk about how they tried to strip Jordan Childs of her bronze medal, which I think ultimately will be motivation for her. But just think about, all of the things that are happening in the world today, obviously here in the US, right? And understanding how all of these things have a certain origin in what I would argue, but what Toni Morrison is saying, nationhood, the very definition of citizenship, constantly being demarcated and re-demarcated in response to exiles, refugees, immigrants, migration, displacement, fleeing, besieged, right? Anxiety of belonging, identity, entombed within the central metaphors and discourse of globalism, transnationalism, right? All of these competing ideas, notions, and fictions of sovereignty. What is the role of the state? Right, the state of exception, right? Necropolitics, right? States deciding who gets to live and who gets to die, right? All of these things are very racialized, right? Very much come out of the history and the legacy of post-slavery societies like the US. Okay. And so, if you think about anti-colonial theorist Sylvia Wynter's arguments about the struggle of the new millennium, um, being this sort of struggle for humanity, right? Due to the overrepresentation of whiteness as the human, as she would say, right? It's really brings home the fact that we have to decolonize the mind. We have to begin to think outside the box. We have to begin to think in contrary images, right? So Alan Watts, who I mentioned earlier, writes, put it in the context of unlearning the socialized Anglo-anthropomorphic image of God. One often encounters in Western cultures. Okay. All right. So let me back up. As the Buddhist philosopher Alan Watts, who's European, put it in the context of unlearning the socialized Anglo-anthropomorphic image of God, one often encounters in Western culture. The images of God have a far more powerful effect upon our emotions than our ideas, right? And so we should think of God, first of all, in contrary imagery, okay? In contrary imagery. So what does that mean? The contrary imagery is she's Black, right? Imagine instead of God the Father, God the Mother. And imagine that this is not a luminous being blazing with light, but an unfathomable darkness, end quote. Okay. So think about that. Think about what we just said about what we just talked about in terms of, or I talked about in terms of dark matter, dark energy, expanding. Think about what the ancient texts talk about. And we're going to get more into that in a second in terms of the primordial darkness, right? The primordial waters, right? The firmament, right? The Lord of the perfect black, right? Think about all of these ways in which darkness is constantly sort of just perennially there. Think about the darkness of your own melanin, right? That literally gives our nervous system, right, when we're developing in our mother's womb, right? The darkness of the womb, right? The womb world. Think about that melanated substance that is so vital to pineal glands, to our nervous system, to all of our glands, right? To our bodies, to allowing us to function at a high level, to our hormones, right? Um, Things that allow us, biologically speaking, to be human, right? And so, really making these connections. Um, you know, another classic, an instant vintage classic, just published last year by Dr. Charles Finch, right? Now Valley Civilization. I know Dr. Brown is going to be meeting with and speaking with Dr. Finch here in the coming days. But in his book, it says something really, really powerful, and I'm just going to read the quote because I won't get into the rest of it, my commentary, but he's reminding us in this magnum opus of a book, really, really truly incredible work. The largest number of Africans carried to the New World on the Middle Passage was taken from the stretch of the coast in Western Africa, from the Senegal River in the north to the Congo in the south, whose peoples in many instances could trace their origins to the Nile Basin. Okay, so just making these historical geographical connections, right? There's therefore a definitive link those seemingly attenuated by time, between diasporic Africans in the Americas and the cultures of the people of the ancient Nile Valley. Thus, to reestablish the connection linking ancient Nile Valley civilization to West Africa and hence to the diasporic West African communities in the Americas is critical through the process of recovering the Kosan of people of African descent. The word Kosan is Wolof, the word Kosan in Wolof combines in one word the meaning of history, tradition, cultural lore, and spiritual heritage. It has become an article of faith that the recovery of Kosan must undergird any substantive rehabilitation of global Africa, right? Global Africa, Pan Africa. right? Pan-African education and socialization, right? One of the things to the comment that was made at the outset about language, uh, in terms of how can we decolonize the mind if we're constantly speaking in the idiom, right? And this is what Ahmed Cesar is doing in a Tempest, right? In his sort of signifying on Shakespeare's The Tempest, right? And he talks about Caliban and Prospero, and he talks about how he's like, what did I get from Western culture? What have I been given by my oppressors? Nothing, right? Except for the ability to cuss, right? It's this idea that we have been indoctrinated with this language that we sometimes take pride in more so than the very people who imposed it upon us, right? And we can talk about, other aspects of culture as well, right? And so how do we begin to unlearn that miseducation, right? Is very important if we're going to realize our true potential as spiritual beings having a human experience. And so with that, one of the things that I'm intentional about, and I tell my students all the time, is, hey, never refer to yourself as a minority, right? We are not minorities, right? In the ways that matter most, right? Yet now, granted, we may be in a specific circumstance or context, you may be a demographic minority. You may be the only, Black person, African in a room. You may be the only woman in a room and you walk into a room, you might be the only one there, right? Who looks like you, right? Or with your background, but you are not, in the ways that matter most, globally and genetically, you are not a minority. Never have been, right? And so we have to, break that psychology of referring to ourselves as minorities, because we're not minorities, right? So quite the opposite. And so what does this look like? Well, ultimately, this is we come back to Garvey, right? This piece is called Look for Me in the Whirlwind. The praxis, which is the theory and the practice of Pan-Africanism, right? I like to think of myself as the professor of praxis, meaning I'm thinking, I'm theorizing, I'm reflecting, and I'm also doing. It's about the application of knowledge, right? Because the application of knowledge is wisdom, right? We can know a lot, but if we can't make it real, if we can't apply that knowledge, then what, is it knowledge for knowledge's sake? No, we've got to go beyond that. And so, when we talk about Pan-African culture, Pan-African centered education and socialization, it's about practice. It's about the application of knowledge. It's about realizing what Garvey prophesied in 1937, right? And which Bob Marley then kind of captured in song, right? We are going to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. For though others may free the body, none but ourselves can free the mind, right? You have to free your mind. We have to free our minds, right? And we can be free in lots of other ways, but if our mind is still mentally enslaved, all that freedom is going to result into advancing and furthering other people's interest, right? Other people's culture, other people's worldview, other people's concept of the divine, other people's et cetera, music, right? Other people's ideas. And so we want to make this prophecy a reality. Okay. Let me just check in, Sister Adwa, with time, and if you could kind of give me a sense of where we are. I want to say a little bit more, but I also want to make sure we have time for Q&A and some
Yes,
conversation.
yes, thank you. We're good for time. So feel free to finish the presentation. And then for the audience, please begin putting your questions in the Q&A box, and we will do the Q&A shortly.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm not going to get to everything tonight, but hopefully this is just kind of a start of a conversation that I've been having with Tony and others. But I'm trying to distill some of these ideas in a way that is accessible and makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about perception and the science of the neuroscience of perception, right? Um, because we don't control necessarily things that happen outside of us, but we have the ability to control our perception, I mean, the meaning we attach to our experiences, right? Our circumstances, right? And a lot of times our greatest power lies in just simply how we choose to interpret reality, how we choose to perceive, right? And the things that we experience. Now we're all having a human experience, and therefore we are constantly um, running up against the perceptual envelope of our five senses, right? However, the mind, as I said before, is infinite. And so the mind allows us to transcend the perceptual envelope of our five senses and allows us to tap into extrasensory perception, if you will, right? Allows us to dream, to imagine, right? To remember, right? In all kinds of ways, the mind allows us to transcend the physical body, okay? And so, and in the mind, I'm speaking of consciousness, right? Not only the conscious waking mind, but also the subconscious, right? Um, and in fact, the subconscious is the more powerful of the two, right? If something gets stuck into your subconscious, it has to be manifest, right? And so or manifested, because the subconscious mind, I would argue, is kind of like it's the magic machine, right? It's the thing that allows us to give material form and shape in our dimensional reality to things that existed that begin as our thoughts, right? And this is the science of mind. This is, James Allen. This is, all of the folks throughout time who have talked about, this science of mind, right? The importance of perception, right? The power of the mind, the power of conscious thought, the power of affirmation and intention, right? All of these things it's not magical thinking. It's actually supported scientifically. When you really look closely at quantum physics, you begin to understand thoughts have vibrate. Everything is energy, right? We're living in an energetic reality, vibrating at a different frequency, right? And so, what is the frequency of your vibration, right? Love is the high frequency vibration, right? And so, how we move and interact with one another, the vibe, as a Tribe Called Quest put it, in a Love Movement album, right? Check the vibe, right? It's a vibe, right? What is the vibe, right? So what is our perception? So if you check out, you can go online and look at the perceptioninstitute.org, I believe is the URL. Perception Institute. It's an interesting project looking at the science of perception. You may be familiar with the implicit bias test and other sort of research projects that have looked at implicit cognition, implicit bias, and just the way that our minds kind of default to dichotomous thinking, right? Kind of default to lean on inherited ideas, stereotypes about other people as we sort of navigate life, and then what it means to sort of register that, but then also to override some of those knee-jerk reactions and perceptions that we may or may not even be cognizant of, right? So one of the things that they talk about is that they say, unless disrupted, stereotypes embedded in our brains can turn into implicit biases and lead to discrimination over time. This is part of the work that I do with my nonprofit, in advancing human freedom and flourishing, sans or without bias, right? So what does it mean to have an unbiased investment in freedom, right? Not just for this group or that group, but for all people, right? Instead of cherry picking who gets to be free, who gets to have sovereignty, who gets to have rights, who has the right to defend themselves, right? No, everyone has that right, right? And so we have to be unbiased in terms of how we act on or even express, these ideals that we claim that claim to inform our identity, our nation, right? Freedom, democracy, justice, right? Equity or equality, right? There's a lot of hypocrisy, right? And how those ideas get applied or not, right? So if we can, unless we disrupt stereotypes embedded in our brains, though they can turn into implicit bias. Okay. And racial anxiety, the concern that we might confirm our own biases or experience bias from someone else, makes racial navigation even more challenging, right? So I teach a class on race and ethnicity in the US. We're going to talk about this semester some of these ideas, right? Recent research in psychology, neuroscience, and the social sciences has made huge strides in understanding how automatic processes in the brain shape our perceptions, our actions, and our decision making. Research also gives us insight into how we can override our biases to bring them more in line with our conscious values. More in line with our conscious values. Going back, what are those values? Right? What did Ellison say? Our ancestors we create ourselves out of those conscious values, right? The values, the conscious values embodied in the lives and legacies of our ancestors, okay? So there's a Nigerian American artist, Toyin Odutola, who you can see kind of an example of this, her work, one of her portraits on the left here. I think this is a self-portrait actually. And she says, because of who I am, the construct is before me. So the construct of race, that is. So I have to deal with the concept of being Black, right? And if you look at her work, you see she spends a lot of time on, giving representation to various shades of Blackness, right? The luminosity of that deep indigo, blue-black skin, right? And what that means, when Fanon talks about, the fact of Blackness, right? How striking our complexions, our skin, our physical phenotype features can be, and all of the meaning that's been ascribed and projected onto the Black body, as it were, right? As an object rather than a subject, right? So what does it mean to sort of take that power back, right? To recognize difference, right? Recognize difference, to redefine identity, and to reclaim our power, right? This is, I guess, sort of a triptych, a tripartite process that I'm suggesting we need to engage in. And again, just to pay homage to Brother Browder and the work he's done, he writes, when African people ruled the earth thousands of years ago, Black skin was a badge of honor. The color Black was associated with God and various aspects of divinity. If we make a conscious decision to refer to ourselves as Black, then we must continually strive to restore dignity to Blackness, particularly in the English language, right? Which is what he goes on to talk about, which is what Baldwin talks about, being at war with the English language, right? Which is what Ossie Davis, Malcolm X. I could go on and on and on. Examples of Africans in America wrestling with the meaning, the way that we have been defined within the linguistic context of European languages, English, French, Latin. Okay, even though many of those languages are derivative, also, and go all the way back to hieroglyphics and the Medu Neter, right? They have been bastardized and corrupted and made to denigrate, I should say, Blackness, rather than understanding originally that Blackness was associated with divinity. That's why judges wear Black robes. Okay, there's a sense of power, right, within that. That's why when we just got done watching the Olympics, look at the icon of the Olympics. They say it represents the nations of the world. But think about it though, it's not just that, right? You have I don't have it in front of me. Like, I think it's the red ring, the gold or the yellow, the black, and then like the green and the blue. Okay. But the black is always in the center. There's 5 rings, the black is in the center. And we know within fine art and color theory, black is what? Black is actually not a color. It's the presence of all colors, right? Right. And white is the absence of all color. Okay. So black and white technically in the fine arts are not colors, right? They're the presence of all colors or the absence of all colors. But Blackness therein contains all the possibility for all the other colors, right? And that makes sense to me, right? If you think about it metaphysically, if you think about it in terms of, there's very, very small, but also the very, very big. And if you think about it in terms of human genetics, right? When we don't have time to get into our sister in the ISIS papers. Frances Cress Welsing, God, may she rest in peace and rise in power. But those of you who have read, the ISIS papers and know that her work in terms of understanding the psychology of racism, what she would call, global system of white supremacy, right, quote unquote. That from the genetic level to the macro level, darkness, blackness is very, very important. And so what is this? What does it look like for us to sort of revalorize? There was a reason in the 60s that we said, black is beautiful, that we said, I'm black and I'm proud, that we said, we want black power, right? There was a reason for that, right? And so I want us to begin to understand the importance of that. Again, okay, so about 5 minutes. We're gonna start Q&A. So let me just get through a few more, and then we'll just pause and we'll get some questions and some conversation going on. And I appreciate you all bearing with me. Just to again touch on this piece, and this may have come a little bit out of order, but we got to get beyond double consciousness, right? Like W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the greatest, most foremost minds of the 20th century, and I think what he articulated, he was in some ways the father of American sociology, but also critical race theory in a way, right? Because that's what double consciousness is. That's what Souls of Black Folks is doing. And he's talking about how to survive this terrain, right? But we also have to move beyond double consciousness, right? And I think that's where the impetus for African-centered movements and identity and socialization, education really is about, hey, we understand how to play the game. We understand that we've had to do that. Now it's time for us to evolve. We have to grow. And so Toni Morrison, in that article that I mentioned earlier, she says, hey, Du Bois's observation about double consciousness is a strategy, not a prophecy or a cure. It's a strategy, right? We have to get beyond the dichotomous double consciousness, right? We have to see the world, see the self through African eyes. Okay, so that's the point that I'm trying to drive home in part. And so with that, that's when we get into Pan-African centered education and socialization. I mentioned before, I'm going to gloss through some of this because it's not as important right now, but this is the work that I do with the African Diaspora Institute. And you can kind of, we can talk more about that later if you're interested. I'll be happy to talk about, some of the projects that we're doing. We're in conversation in California, doing some work in hopefully doing some work with the Pasadena Unified School District around a Pan-African immersive storytelling initiative for Black youth out there in California. And that's something that I would like to see taken to scale, across the country. And so, again, being mindful that we have to achieve greatness by looking within and tapping into our roots. History has shown that wherever culturally centered people travel throughout the world, they knew that the retention of their language, culture, philosophy, laws, and God concepts were essential to their survival, right? And so I think we should all have those of us who are in the Americas, we should all shout out to African ancestry. We should all connect, do our due diligence, find out genetically where our origins are. We should reconnect with those countries on the continent. We should be invested in reinvesting in the continent. We should connect with African governments to affect dual citizenship status, right? We should do these things to reconnect the links in the diaspora. And advance our people as a whole, collectively, in the spirit of Pan-Africanism. And so, I'm looking at working to do that through the inspired by a lot of Dr. Browder, Tony's work in terms of restoring the African mind and what that means. And so these are things that are on the horizon as I continue to try to, unlike the men's U.S. Olympic relay team, we're not going to drop the baton. Okay, some of you may have seen that I ran track. The women 4x1 or was it 4x4? They won gold and the men DQ'd. Okay, can't have that. We can't. We got to do better. We got to do better. And so there's a literal baton passing in track and field, but there's also a more important and sort of big picture baton passing that has to happen. And so it's important that those of us of the younger generation are prepared to accept the baton as being passed to us, you know, because none of us lives forever. We all have work to do, and then we transition and we come back when it's time. But at least in one concept of how things work. But those of us who are here having an incarnation, we got to be able to carry the baton forward. Okay, so I'm sure I'm over time. There's more we could talk about, and maybe we'll get into it during the Q&A. But I'll end here with this collage called "The Evolution of W.E.B. Du Bois." Digital collage I created. I do a lot of my artistic work under the name Akheru August, which I should say, part of the reason why I wanted to present this at this time, and I'm glad that it worked out, is that we are celebrating Black August this month. And so I want to acknowledge those who are still living, like Asada and others, freedom fighters, political prisoners who have struggled behind bars and in the land of the free, so to speak, to advance our self-determination, but also recognizing that Black August is a tradition that goes back beyond the 1960s and the 1970s and the prison uprisings that took place with George Jackson and Attica and the like, and the Panthers, all the way back to the Haitian Revolution and to various insurrections that were led by enslaved Africans on these shores. So salute to those folks who have continued to fight for freedom, who are freedom fighters, and I'll just end here with what this enduring understanding from two brilliant minds, John Henry Clark, A Great and Mighty Walk, talking about understanding history, and W.E.B. Du Bois, who said we can no longer regard Western Europe and North America as the world for which civilization exists, nor can we look upon European culture as the norm for all people. Henceforth, the majority of the inhabitants of the earth, who happen, for the most part, to be colored, must be regarded as having the right and the capacity to share in human progress and to become co-partners in that democracy which alone can ensure peace among men by the abolition of poverty, the education of the masses, protection from disease, and the scientific treatment of crime. That's from Colonies and Peace, Color and Democracy, 1945. So I'll stop there and let's have some conversation. Thank you so much for your patience. And I know that was a little long, but I'm looking forward to some dialogue.
Great. Wonderful presentation. Thank you, Dr. Akheru. To our family and audience, again, we're going to begin our Q&A session. So we are asking that if you have questions for our speaker, to please place them in the Q&A box. So that's separate from the chat box. We want to put them in the Q&A box to make sure that your question is seen and asked. So while you all are getting your questions together and typing them in, I just want to take a moment to remind you all about the Abibi Tumi conference, where Tony Browder will be speaking on September 7th. I will place that link back in the chat for you all, but the address is conference.abibitumi.com. Want to also remind you all about the ASA Restoration Project weekend of events that will include a live discussion with Anthony Browder and Charles Finch on Friday, September 20th, and Tony Browder speaking at the Tutankhamun exhibit September 21st, which is a Saturday, from 7 to 10 p.m. in Washington, D.C. I will also place links for those events in the chat. So I'm going to start with some questions. But first, just going to quick question. Our media is asking if you know of any events happening in Black August, since you just brought that up. Are you familiar with any upcoming Black August events?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was listening to a radio program about a week ago, and I know there's a website, probably a number of websites that, have information about events and programs happening around the country. I can't think of it off the top of my head right now. I was in California, and so there's mm, I think it's called Black August Los Angeles. I believe if you Google that, you should be able to find some of the events that they're involved in. But they're, that's in California, so I don't know where folks are. Um, but I know that there are some organizations across the country who are doing, events. I know the Pan African Film Festival is in Los Angeles this every year this month. Um, in fact, I believe when I first saw the film Sankofa uh, by Haile Gramira in Los Angeles at that film festival, a long time ago, right? Um, that was what, 93, I think. But that film festival is ongoing, and then there are others, around the country. So I would just encourage those of you who are interested in, participating in Black August, which is a great way to kind of think about Black futures and self-determination in concert with Black History Month. I didn't get to George Washington Carver, but he's in there. It's important that we think about how to engage around Black August, because really it's oriented toward, okay, resistance and what resistance has meant in terms of self-determination for our people. But Black August LA, Los Angeles, I think has some content, if you Google that. And then I would just look in your local area and see, what folks are doing. Thank you.
Wonderful. Our next question comes from Jeanette. Now, Jeanette was also asked about the language of oppression and how that impacts the decolonization of the mind. She
Mhm.
also asked, is Pan Africanism a moot issue given the prevalence of people equivocating about their African heritage and given the splitting of hairs about who is an African American, which has been defined to exclude people of the diaspora living outside of America or who have come relatively recently as immigrants?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I mean, it is a challenge. It is a challenge for sure. The internal division, but we have to remember something. Well, first of all, it's not a moot point to me. In my view, it's definitely not a moot point. I think that there has been, just like Du Bois talked about, he wrote his doctoral dissertation, right? First Black man to graduate from Harvard University on the suppression of the African slave trade, right? Or the European slave trade, right? The transatlantic slave trade. And so, in that same way, I believe that the Pan-African movement, Pan-Africanism as an ideology, certainly as a political ideology, has been suppressed, right? A lot of us, I think, have been traumatized and terrorized out of being willing to advocate for ourselves, being willing to assert certain political demands. And that trauma and that fear is not irrational. It's rational because it's based on the history of terrorism, assassinations, and exploitations and bombings, and this is all, since the civil rights era for the most part, right? Even since then, I mean, we don't have to go down a list of examples that terrorism is still happening at this very moment. So there's a way in which, you know even articulating a political point from a Black perspective is demonized, and it's demonized not so much by white Americans or European Americans or other people. It's critiqued and attacked within the Black community oftentimes, right? Sadly, right? And so that's true, but we have to, those tensions exist, but we also have to remember, and we have to understand strategy. We have to understand, and that since Africans were brought to America, and I do believe, I know there was an African presence in the Americas prior to right? The transatlantic slave trade, but that's another topic. But certainly during the antebellum era, um, the attempt to divide and conquer, right, to create indemnity between black men and black women to dismantle and destroy the black family, which is the seed of the black nation, right, of any nation, right? That that has been happening from jump, right? And so the sort of splitting of hairs, as you put it, and equivocating, as you talked about, in terms of who's an African American, you know, when did you get here? Are you an immigrant? What's the tensions between, you know, Africans in the diaspora and Africans from the continent, and you know, the way in which immigrants who come to this country are indoctrinated, right, into even African immigrants, right, are taught to look down and and are fed the same stereotypes that we ourselves are fed, right? So there's a lot of work that has to be done. There's a lot of internal inferiority that has to be uh, um unlearned, right? There's a lot of there's an internal inferiority complex that has to be dealt with, right? There's a lot of healing that has to happen. You know, there's a lot of, you know, colorism is the stepchild or the grandchild of racism, right? So it's we have those issues, and I think that one of the things that I loved about the original Black Panther film by Ryan Coogler, who by the way talks about Pan-Africanism as a motivation for his making that film, you know, and especially the first one, and to it in a different way, the second one, you know, in terms of thinking about this black and brown, right, alliance, right? But particularly with the first film, you know, that film was about trying to address some of those tensions within our community, right? And so I do work right now on reparations, and one of the ways in which these conversations have manifested is in the form of who should receive or who should be eligible for reparations for slavery, right? For the enslavement of Africans in North America, right? And what does that look like? What are the criteria upon which restitution should be paid, should be based, and what does restitution itself even look like, right? In terms of monetary, but also social programs and other things, right? And so as we've seen some positive momentum in the long history of the reparations movement, um, these issues have cropped back up. Um, you know, well, you're not, you know, sort of blacker than thou, and well, you're black, but you're from West Indies, and you didn't, you know, you. So, in my view, I think that, you know, I go back to what Malcolm X said, right? Malcolm X in '64 talked about, yeah, when he founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity, right? And he wrote Message to the Grassroots. And Dr. Betty Shabazz, who got her PhD 10 years after Malcolm was assassinated, right? Studied the Organization of African Unity, which was the basis, right, on the continent, which was the basis for the OAAU. Okay. And Betty Shabazz and Malcolm understood the need for unity. Cheikh Anta Diop understood when he wrote Black Africa, right? The economic and political basis for our scholars, our foremost scholars, understood that without unity, we would not be able to achieve self-determination fully, right? And so we have to do as Malcolm X said, you know, we are diverse, right? Black people are not a monolith, all right? We are as diverse as it gets. In fact, we are more diverse, right? There's more bio diversity on the continent of Africa than there is out between Africans and other people all around the world. So we are, and that makes sense, right? That makes sense because Homo sapiens sapiens, yeah, humanity, right? The man who knows that he knows, right? We originate in Africa, right? Mitochondrial Eve, Decanesh, Lucy, you know, right? We understand that. And so it makes sense, as I said before, even in color theory and fine art, blackness is the presence of all colors. So isn't it interesting then that biologically, right, humanity would originate in Africa, and out of Africa, we would get the ethnic diversity that is the human species, the human family, right? The race. There is really only one race in that sense, right? It's the human race, right? But the human race has its origins in Africa, right? And so we have to understand that in order for us to achieve our ultimate goals, we must have unity. We must have the South African, I think it's Khoisan word Ubuntu must be realized, right, in order for us to achieve our goals. So we don't have time for you're from over here and I'm from over there. You're light skinned, I'm dark skinned. You're no, we don't have time for that. That will get us killed. That is what will not result in our ultimate goal. We have to be able to, as Malcolm said, close ranks. If it's religious, hey, I respect everyone's religion, but right now we need to be able to put our religion aside, put our differences aside, and organize right around our common interest. And we all experience this world as Africans, okay? And so we're from all over the place, but we have to be able to close ranks, and we have to understand that we all experience racism, like Dr. Francis Cress Welsing said. Unfortunately, the world, the whole entire world, has been infected by the disease, the dis-ease, right? The mental depravity of structural racism, of white racial dominance, right? Of the myth of white supremacy, right? And so we have to understand that even though we have had localized experiences of that oppression, right, it's something that has influenced all of us, including non-Black people, right? And so, that's a long answer to your question, but I would say that we really need to think more strategically about how we move. All right. We need to be much more strategic about how we move and about how we educate and socialize our children. I didn't even get into the conversation about rites of passage and going more into depth about what I'm really trying to do with the PACES initiative. But we really have to be thoughtful about how we are projecting ourselves into the future. And we don't have time. We simply don't have time for squabbles.
Well, speaking of that, an attendee anonymously is asking, what is the current state of cooperation between African countries? I see that there are many wars currently happening between African countries.
Yeah, so I guess there's kind of good and bad, on balance. I'm not an expert on all things happening on the continent, but just from observation and conversation, I know there are a number of African countries, particularly West African countries, particularly Ghana, who are really trying to reconnect and quite frankly attract foreign investment from Africans in North America, right? I have met myself twice the Ghana's ambassador to the U.S., who is the first woman, and her name is escaping me right now. I apologize, but she is the first woman ambassador to the U.S. from Ghana in Ghana's history. And of course, there is, the African American Association of Ghana. There are a number of expats living in Ghana, some of whom I'm in conversation with. And so I think that there is some awareness on the continent about the need and the utility, if nothing else, even if it's simply in economic terms, of partnering and collaborating with Africans in the diaspora, particularly here in the U.S. Obviously, there are, like here in Maryland, there's a strong Ethiopian community. There are, kind of pockets of West Africans that have immigrated to the U.S. over the past several decades and kind of set up communities. But one of the things that we have to understand is that, as African Americans, or we could say, as the descendants of enslaved Africans in the Americas, going back to the antebellum era, right, to just kind of distinguish, right, between what we classically think of as African Americans versus more recent immigrants to America. We have to understand that our experience is different. It is different, right? And that's a good thing, right? It has allowed us to be at the forefront, to be at the vanguard of many of the more progressive and even radical movements, right? Throughout the diaspora, right? Our movements here have influenced the world, period, right? including, movements on the continent for self-determination, right? And so you've always had, Nkrumah was at Lincoln University, right? You had Du Bois is buried in Ghana, right? I mean, we have these connections exist. Unfortunately, we have not gotten to a level of consciousness, and this is why, in my view, Pan-African Black consciousness is so important. Because if you have that consciousness, you're not going to look at, your Eritrean. If I'm Ethiopian and you're Eritrean, and we have this conflict, okay, yes, there's a history to that conflict in North Africa. It has its own dimensions and nuances, but ultimately we have to be able to see a bigger view. We have to have a goal that's bigger than that, and that's what the African Union is trying to do. That's what Gaddafi was trying to do, right? Um, in terms of thinking about how do we create an economic basis for African unity, right? So we can compete on the global stage, right? Because if we look at the African continent, we had the same thing happening today that was happening during the formal era of European colonialism, right? With the Berlin Conference and everything that came subsequent to that, we have neo-colonialism in terms of China making a lot of investment in Africa, building infrastructure, but bringing Chinese labor to do that work, and multinational corporations, you know, dealing with these corrupt African leaders, getting these like 100-year leases on the mines so they can mine coltan, so they can mine, which is what goes into all of our iPhones and Teslas and any lithium, any battery technology, that those minerals are in the Congo, right? Just like they were doing, just like King Leopold was chopping off people's hands for rubber, right? Just like in the U.S., we were enslaved to produce what? Sugar, rice, tobacco, cotton. Okay, so the legacy of slavery and colonialism is a global reality that we have to contend with, and we have to contend with it in the modern times in terms of structural adjustment programs from the World Bank and the IMF, right? In terms of internet, global monetary finance, right? And loans and that kind of so neoliberal capitalist architecture, right? In terms of climate change, right? And climate racism and what climate justice looks like, particularly in the global south below the equator, right? Where the brunt of global warming in terms of hurricanes and natural disasters tends to take place. Okay. We have to contend with all of these things. And one of the ways that I do that work, because none of us can do all of it, but I try to do that work in the field of education, because I realize that until we have the consciousness to say, you know what, us coming together in unity it was the only thing that is necessary in order for us to come together on a broader scale and really compete on the world stage the way that we should. But there are external forces and there are internal forces that have been corrupted that are working against those efforts. So we just have to realize that is the landscape, and we have to pour into future generations so that those who come behind us have the awareness, right? And they're not going to succumb to some of the same seduction, some of the same temptations, some of the same old tired tropes that have kind of befuddled and hamstrung our efforts at creating really a robust African unity, economically, politically. I mean, we can go back to the Arusha conference in the 70s, with Julius Nyerere. I mean, the architecture has been the work has been done. It's there, but we don't even know about it because we're not learning about it. Certainly not learning about it in public schools, right? And so when we look at what other communities do in this country, whether it's the Chinese, Jewish community, you name it, okay? One of the things they do that we don't do is they educate and socialize their children culturally, so that even though they're learning the Common Core curriculum in school, they're also learning about their history, their culture, and those values, right? And we're not doing that enough. We are doing it, but we're not doing it to the level that we should be, right? In order to have a future that's truly in which we can thrive right? And not just, I mean, be caught in this sort of hamster wheel of subsistence, right? Because when you're poverty is the biggest pimp out here, right? If you're constantly kept at a level of survival, just trying to feed your family, just trying to pay the bills, so on and so forth, you're not going to be able to look up out of that rat race, right? Long enough to be able to begin to think and reflect on some of these larger ideas that I'm talking about. So we have to get to a level, and that's where I talk about, what does freedom really look like in the 21st century, right? It can't just be about civil rights, right? Okay. Well, what does financial freedom look like, right? What does it mean psychologically to be free, right? If you still have an image of a white man in your home on the wall, which some people do, I can I look my own mother-in-law, okay, because she, was socialized by the Catholic Church to even though they got everything that they understand from us, she was socialized to view the Pope and the various saints, et cetera, as deity, right? And she still sees them that way, right? So there's a need there to decolonize and to heal the mind, right? Because the mind is where it all begins.
Okay, thank you. Family, I'm going to ask two more questions, and we're going to wrap up in the next couple of minutes. So I'm going to try to get these next two questions in for us, and then close out. Thank you all for still being with us. Um, the next question is, can you elaborate more on the subject of Adinkra symbols as a symbol of power?
Yeah, well, it's the Ndink, the Akan, we're dealing with West Africa, we're dealing with Ghana, we're dealing with an aesthetic, right? A semiotics or an iconography of symbolic images that are because a symbol, like when people say, a painting is worth 1,000 words or an image is worth 1,000 words. The way our brains work, and this is why I believe our ancestors in their genius um invented hieroglyphics, right? And they devised a system of writing that involved resonance, right? Like the Medu Neter, when you start to learn the Medu Neter, or the ancient kind of Kemetic language, and you transliterate it into hieroglyphics, or from the hieroglyphics, and you translate it then into English or French or whatever, you know, it's a process. But one of the things that's always struck me about um, these ancient languages is sort of the vibratory resonance of certain words. Now, if we think about the metaphysics of colors, sounds, and symbols, and numbers, I'm sorry. So music, right? Excuse me, music, you have, and I'm not an ethnomusicologist or a musician, but I do know that music, certain tones, certain vibrations have an emotional effect on the body. And that's because these are different frequencies that we're working with, right? So in jazz, when you hear like a blue note, this idea, well, where does that come from? There's a book called Seeing Jazz that kind of explores this, but basically colors, numbers, and sounds all have a sort of have metaphysical properties in terms of the way that they influence the human body, right, and the mind, right. And so when we are dealing with art and we're dealing with aesthetics, we're dealing with symbols, we are actually, it's a way of encoding meaning, um almost like sort of I'm reaching for. Like something that's very simple and concise, but that like contains volumes of information. So like a computer chip, or like something you can open on your phone that seems very small, but when you open it up, it opens up, it unfolds, and you have all this information that's contained in a very simple and small symbol. That's in my view, at least in terms of like the science of it, what Ndinkra symbols do. And talk about symbols of power. Well, they're powerful because each one of those symbols is encoded with meaning, cultural meaning, philosophical meaning, and those of the people who are initiated, who understand the meaning, can look at a symbol and be like, oh, I know what that is. I know what that, you know. And that's why those symbols are so. It's interesting that Ndinkra symbols are all over the world, and you see them. I mean, you can see them in like the logo for like I think the Hilton. If you look at the logo for some like corporations, they look very much like Ndinkra symbols, or they're kind of, it seems as though they're based on Ndinkra symbols. If you start to do that sort of visual analysis, you realize that wow, these symbols have been appropriated by other cultures. That's how powerful they are. Um, and so I had two in my presentation that you may have noticed in the corners. One was Nyame, which is sort of the symbol in the Ndinkra for like the power of God, fear none except God, right? Just the God concept. And then one was education, sort of about this idea of education, and so I would encourage you to definitely like explore that. It's a great, especially for kids. Like if you have young children and you want to expose them to West African culture, there's many others. West African cultural traditions. You can do really, really great projects for kids, creating Ndinkra symbols and talking about their meaning. Obviously, if you practice Kwanzaa, you're going to see Ndinkra symbols all throughout, and so it's important, going back to what was said earlier, images, language, these are aspects of culture, religion or spirituality. And so ideally, all people of African descent would speak probably, a common language, right? Like an African language, like Swahili, right? Because that has a large demographic speaking population, at least on the continent already, right? I don't know, I don't speak Swahili, I never learned it, but strategically, it would be in our best interest to have a common language. And then we could all have, a traditional African language or language that we maybe speak, that's indigenous to our specific ethnic group, because Africa has, I mean, so many languages, right? Um, and then because of history, as a result of colonialism, many of us have also a colonial language, right? English, French, Spanish, okay? And so, or maybe even Arabic, right? Or even Chinese, right? But I think we should all have a common language, because language is also a sign, a semiotics, a sign system, right? We should have a common language, and we should also be familiar with certain cultural iconography and Ndinkra symbols, for example, hieroglyphics, right? Understanding that we have a strong oral tradition, but we also have a very strong written and visual tradition as well. That is our inheritance, that we should be proud of, and that we should reclaim, right? In that Sankofa is an Ndinkra symbol, right? This is a good example. That symbol, Sankofa, has become probably the most widely recognized Ndinkra symbol in the world. And part of that recognition comes from the fact that it has been taken up throughout the world as a symbol of reclaiming one's culture, right? So I think it's a powerful example, and obviously the title of the film Sankofa, which was that film is one of the greatest films of all time in my view, in terms of what that what that film portrayed. That film portrayed, that narrative portrayed this idea, the very principle of the film, right? And what I'm talking about, reconnecting, decolonizing the mind, reestablishing our connections to our African heritage, and then governing ourselves and educating our children and embracing a worldview that is predicated upon that our history, right?
All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Thank you, Dr. Akheru, for your presentation.
Thank you.
Um, there was another question. We didn't have time to get to it, so hopefully you were able to still gain a lot of information from tonight's session about decolonizing our mind and empowering ourselves. So thank you so much. I want to again encourage everyone to go to ikgculturalresourcecenter.com. There you will get information about some of our upcoming programs, including our Egypt on the Potomac field trips. So we are still in the season for Egypt on the Potomac. So definitely sign up if you haven't already taken the field trips. And if you have, come back, bring a friend. I want to also invite you all out to our next Wisdom Wednesday, which will take place on September 18th, featuring our founder and director, Anthony Browder. So he, of course, will be coming to speak on behalf of the ASA Restoration Project. And that is also the same week that he will be hosting the ASTA Restoration 16th anniversary events. So again, those links are in the chat for the Abibi Tumi conference and the ASA Restoration Project weekend of events, including the brother to brother discussion and the talk at the Tutankhamun exhibit. Thank you all again for coming out. This presentation will be uploaded to our IKG Cultural Resource Center YouTube page for your further viewing. So thank you all. Be blessed, and we will see you next time.
Thank
Peace.
you. Bye bye.